So what we're going to talk about today is around social choice and decentralizing research, but the end goal is really around accelerating the right research that matters the most to those that are affected by a specific condition or disease. And the method that Ian developed is what we call community-driven innovation. So what we kind of say when we're thinking about decentralizing the setting of priorities for research is that communities need a seat at the table. And one of the key tables that you need a seat at is a table where the focus of the research is decided. And right now, a lot of times that's happening somewhere in a pharmaceutical company, in an academic researcher, where they just think of some idea that's just interesting to them. But you need that seat at the table because you know, and the people in your communities know what matters most to you. So how do you extract what matters most to you and what matters most to the people in your community? That's what we want to talk about today. And I just put this quote up here because I really liked it from Shirley, who was the first Black woman in Congress back in 1968. She basically said, they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair and make your seat at the table. So we're really focused on trying to help you figure out how to bring that folding chair and put it at the table to make sure that you have that voice. So how do we do that? How do we extract that information from our communities to really understand what matters most? Everybody has their ideas. There are different processes that exist today that have been used in the past and are still being used today. I'm not going to go in depth on this. I think Caitlin is speaking a little bit later and she'll be giving you some use cases around this, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a high level overview of what's sort of going on today and how this is different. So first thing is that focus groups are used a lot today, where you get a group of people together and you ask them questions so that you can gather their priorities. But that's really not the best way to do this. And why? Because groupthink is really bad. It introduces all kinds of bias. You're always going to have those people that are very vocal and shout out their ideas. You're going to have shy people that are just going to sit there quietly and absorb. And you're going to have people that may have spoken up, but those really vocal people kind of skew the conversation towards things that they might not have said. So their top priorities are hidden behind someone else's top priorities. And then the Delphi process is another process out there that's actually, very rigorous in terms of what it does, but they have a concept of only listening to these presumed experts. So who are these experts? Why are they experts? And why do they know more than what you know and what the people in your communities know? So that's why we need to kind of turn this on its head a little bit and change the process so that we can really make it something that's gathering the right insights. And so that's where community-driven innovation comes in. So this is kind of the framework for how community-driven innovation works. There's several different kind of phases for it. At the core, it's a bottom-up iterative process, and it starts with identifying the space. So what is the space that we're interested in? In these situations, it could be the condition, the disease, the families, and people that are affected by the condition and how their day-to-day life happens, how they're managing through, what they're talking about, what they're discussing, what's important to them. So we listen. That's the first thing, is we listen and we identify and we frame the space. Then we start the design phase. And that's where we're really starting to develop the hierarchy of needs. And I'll go into all this in a little bit more detail in the next couple slides. And the third phase is we measure. So how successful is that design? How successful were we at listening and understanding? And then we iterate, iterate, iterate. You never want this process to stop. You want to continuously be listening and learning, because your design and how you measure that design tells you where your gaps are, how it relates and aligns to research, how new things that might become priorities later might fit into that framing of the space that you created. And subsequently, and your end goal is inform research. So you want to continuously be doing this listening, designing, measuring to understand where the priorities really need to be. So let's go into that in just a little bit more detail. So first, as we're kind of framing the space, we're listening. And how do we do that? So we like one-on-one interviews versus that focus group. We might actually send out questionnaires that are filled out by individuals. We do some online listening where people are talking. So in Facebook groups, for example, We do just typical types of market research where we're looking digitally to try to understand what's going on in the space. And then we throw science at it. So Ian likes to talk about a lot of really scientific methods that are used and that are at the core of this methodology. I'm going to try to bring it down a level to make it a little bit easier to understand. We do what we call factor analysis. But really what that means is we take the patterns from these lists that are generated of topics. What are the topics that are being discussed in the space? And we look for patterns, we look for overlaps, and we try to take what is typically a very large list of topics that are being discussed, probably somewhere between 200 and 500 different topics for a single space, and we try to shrink it to a more manageable data set. And we do that using these patterns. And two of the type of mathematical theories that are at the core of this are set theory and node theory. And again, those are just things that are looking at the interconnections between these topics, the patterns between these topics, how these topics relate to each other. And so set theory at its core is like a Venn diagram of how these different things relate. And node theory is about the interconnections between these topics. And so we apply that kind of analysis to these lists, to what we've listened and heard from people in the space. And that creates this manageable list of about 50 to 150 topics that are the most often discussed things in this space, in your community, in this area of this condition. And so then we ask the people in the community to take a look at this list. And what does that look like? Basically, we create what is a survey that asks you to rank these different topics. So we tell you, you have like 150 topics and you have to find your top 5 priorities in under 5 minutes. And people freak out that they only have 5 minutes. And we do that on purpose. We want your gut reaction. And I love something that Ian always says. He says, we're activating your lizard brain. And we're trying to get at your immediate reactions to what is most important to you as you're looking through this list of 150 topics in this space. And we want to know which are your top 5 priorities. We don't want you to overthink it, which is why we put the time restriction on it. We want it to be your immediate reaction, because your immediate reaction is what's most top of mind and most important for you. And different from that Delphi process that we mentioned before, we don't just want to hear from the experts. We want to hear from everybody, people that are affected by the condition, caregivers, family, friends, physicians. Everybody should have a voice that lives in this space. And what's the result of that? Out of that comes what we call top tasks. So this is where we really understand the priorities from the space. So typically you have anywhere from, say, 50 to thousands of people responding to this from your community, depending on what the size of your community is. And depending on the size of your community, that minimum number that's required for statistical significance we can get to. So the top 5 to say 10 items that are your top tasks are what gets 25% of the vote. And typically you have these top tasks that are, again, 5 to 10 of the tasks from that list of 150. They get 25% of the vote. Then you have these middle tasks, which are about 50% of the vote. They're typically things that are supported by or eclipsed by the top tasks. There might be some relevance to them. There might be some overlap, but we'll figure that out as a next step. And then you have a bunch of these tiny tasks. There's typically about 50 or more tiny tasks that get the same amount of vote as those top 5 to 10 tasks. Tiny tasks are things that every community struggles with. They typically are the squeaky wheel. They take a lot of energy. Sometimes they actually block a top task, so you have to handle a tiny task in order to do a top task. And other times they're just in the way because the squeaky wheel is getting the most notice. So we want to get to the point where you as a community have heard from everybody in your community. They aren't biased because they're each contributing this information individually. And you now know what these top 5 to 10 priorities are. And in this example from a Phoenix study that Ian worked on COVID, there were exactly 5, but we've seen anywhere from 5 to 10. Now, at this point, you've unlocked your top priorities. You know things that you need to kind of look at. You can kind of see some of the relationships. You could stop here in the CDI. You already have a ton of really beneficial and actionable information. What you can do just with this information is develop studies to investigate those top tasks. You could create surveys to go after more details on those top tasks. You can also reframe old studies to communicate the findings that are aligned to this new value hierarchy. So this is what matters most. This is what people in your community value most in understanding better. And so a great example that Ian has given before around reframing old studies is there was a study on PXC that was really focused on lesions and calcifications. But a lot of people didn't really understand, what do you mean you're looking at lesions and calcifications? But they understood what loose skin was. That was one of their top priorities, one of the things that came out as their top priorities. And as it happens, the lesions and the calcifications are actually a cause of the loose skin. So if you reframe the study in terms of the loose skin and correlate it to the calcifications and the lesions, they now understand better why that was a priority, why it was important to do. And kind of adding on to that, you can also add better communication back to your communities around the studies, around anything, because now you understand how the members of your communities think, what their mental model is. So you can understand that they use certain terms more often than other terms. They're concerned about these certain things more often. So you can adapt your communication and your own priorities as an advocacy foundation to help that. So even just at this phase, you've already gotten a lot of extremely useful information. And those priorities can also be used to help inform research goals when you talk to pharmaceutical companies or academic collaborators. But you don't have to stop here. So what else can you do? What are the next steps in the CDI? As Ian likes to say, you can go up or you can go down from the top tasks. If you go up, you're trying to understand the relationships between the tasks. So you can do what's called a dendrogram study. And in this case, what you're doing is you're looking at the relationship between the top tasks and the middle tasks. So you're asked again, as members of the community, to look at the list of just the top and middle tasks and start to bucket them into categories. You don't have to make up names of the categories. You can call it bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3, or you can take up names. You can make up names if you want to. That's less important. What's important is that you're saying that topic A, topic B, topic Z are all something that you consider related and that you would bucket them together. And so what you end up with is this kind of tree where you can see some kind of medium level buckets and then some of your bigger buckets. And that helps you understand how your community thinks about these topics in relationship to each other. And one kind of practical application of that is when you think about your information architecture on your website. So even just building out your advocacy's website, you now know, in this example from the Phoenix study, they now know that stress, substance abuse, and a couple other things were all tied together as related in the minds of their members. So whenever they build out aspects of their website related to those topics, they either need to be in the same area or they need to be linked to so that people can go from one to the other, because in their minds, they're going to want to go from one to the other very easily. So that's just one example of a practical application of this type of binning. It also helps you see the different ways that people may talk about the same topic. So for example, the PXE study that I just mentioned, one of your tasks that you were doing the top tasks for could have been calcifications of the skin, and another one could have been loose skin. They're related, and this would have shown how related they were. And then you would be able to, again, adapt your communication, adapt your studies, adapt how you talk about that when you're talking to researchers and your community. So we went up from the top tasks. Now we can also go down from the top tasks. And this is where we're talking about what is the outcomes related to the top tasks that you're most concerned about. So this is going one layer deeper and really understanding that topic in more detail. So this is an example from a women's health priority study that we did, where we did a CDI. And we found that certain topics were of more interest to them than others through the top tasks. One of those was menstruation and understanding more about menstruation. And so what we do is we work with the community to create outcome statements. In this case, an example is an outcome statement around the topic of menstruation is we want to reduce the stigma around menstruation. And so we create a whole bunch of these outcome statements. And then the community is asked to do two things related to each outcome statement. Rank it in terms of how important that outcome statement is to them. So in this example, how important is it to you that we spend time reducing the stigma around menstruation? And second, they also have to rank how well served or underserved do you think that outcome is? So how much effort is already being expended around reducing that stigma? How well has that stigma been reduced, type of thing? And so what you'll end up with is this kind of 4-quadrant chart where things that are the most important and the most underserved end up in your top left. And those topics, you know, are the things that in more detail related to those topics are the most important things that your community wants focused on and what they believe is also the most underserved today. So a very clear indication of some unmet needs in the community. And so what do we do with all of this information? You've gathered all of these insights. You understand your community better than you ever did before. What does that mean? So what can you do with this all? So we talked about a couple of these things already. You can design custom surveys. You now know the topics, even just from the top tasks, that are the most important for you to drill down more and understand more of the experiences from your community. You can develop validated instruments. And we work with groups that can help validate instruments very quickly. Why are validated instruments so important? Because whenever you get to the point where you're going to be working with a pharma to submit, they're going to want to look at something that's data collected in a scientifically rigorous manner. Validated instruments are created to test the quality, the reproducibility, and the inclusiveness of the language used in those surveys. So getting that type of help can be really important. And now you know the exact topics and even details of those topics that you need to focus on. You can also create resources for your community around those high priority topics. So maybe it's not necessarily something specifically related to research, but it's just an area where you know there's resources available, but your members haven't been able to find them. Now you can make that more available on your website. You can also generate abstracts and statistics. And actually now you can proactively build like a pitch deck or a bunch of information that you can provide to pitch to your academic or industry partners to say, look, this is what we understand about our community. These are places where they're going to be the most engaged to enroll in your studies and help you find these answers. And you can actually translate those priorities into secondary endpoints in clinical trials. It's going to be really hard to make them primary endpoints because the FDA pushes back a lot on that if there's not established evidence around those as primary endpoints. But if they're secondary endpoints, that's great. And you build up that body of evidence. So you're finding these ways to make what matters most to your community be the focus of research. And you guys are the ones that understand your communities the best. So by listening to them and by presenting this in a scientifically rigorous manner, you're going to look extremely credible and know that your participants, that your members in your community are going to be engaged to support these types of studies. So that's CDI today. There's other things that we're focusing on to try to take community-driven innovation to the next level and to really help you make the most of this. So one, we're focused on ways of improving the efficiency and scalability of the process. Ian and his team have spent a lot of time this year looking at different ways to get to this information where it's still high quality and statistically significant. And so we're hoping to roll those out over the course of this year. But then there's always the issue with funding. Like, how do we make sure that we can afford doing these CDIs? How do we afford to get the help to get data scientists to help us look at some of this information and create those analyses that will help us attract research partners? And sometimes you'll get volunteers and sometimes you won't. So we're exploring some of the crowdfunding strategies that are really popular today and can be really easily done to get the small amounts of money that you need to support this type of a project. And then of course,
hey Deb, you got about 30 seconds.
I have these 2 bullets and I'm done, so we're good. And then of course you want to translate the findings into simple shareable industry pitches. So you might need help with that as well. And so we're looking at ways to kind of give guidance there as well. And again, just to sum it all up, this is to make sure that you and your community have a seat at the table. And honestly, our end goal is for you to have a seat at the head of the table so that you're driving where the research is going.